what has changed since 2014? Trump was not president at that time, and the world has not completely fallen apart at that time. Now it is a full-fledged war against immigrants, against minority, against the poor, you name it, against the climate, against women, and people like Modi in India and Bolsonaro in Brazil have picked up very quickly on his cues, and they have unleashed their share of terror. So how has it changed so drastically, and what do you foresee for the future?
Well, first of all, the change has been coming for some time, and it's pretty much the same around the world. So take Europe, the centrist political institutions that have been running Europe since the Second World War have virtually collapsed. Election after election, the old traditional parties, center-right, center-left parties, are collapsing. It's pretty much the same happened in the United States in 2016. The parties kept their names, but if you look at what happened, the establishment Republican Party was unable to get their candidate. The Democrats barely squeezed through. If it hadn't been for manipulations of party managers, Sanders might well have won the nomination. And if you look back over the years, you can see that this was coming. So take a look at the Republican primaries for the last roughly 10 or 15 years. Every time a candidate comes from the popular base, they are so outlandish and unacceptable to the establishment that they get crushed. Michelle Bachmann, Rick Santorum, they're just impossible, and they managed to crush them. The difference this time is that they couldn't crush them, but for various reasons. On the Democratic side, this is the first time that there's been a real challenge to the moderate right establishment, which has been the Democratic Party since the 1970s, when they sort of abandoned the working class and became pretty much what used to be moderate Republicans. So all over the world this has been happening, same in the third world countries. And I think there's individual reasons in many places, but there's also some common properties that run through the whole structure. That is the neoliberal programs. I mean, from the end of the Second World War till the 1970s, there were what's in Europe called the 30 Glorieuses, 30 glorious years. Here it's called Golden Age of Capitalism, regimented capitalism, with pretty strong labor unions, very substantial growth, the highest growth in American history, egalitarian growth, improvement in civil rights, civil liberties. The mentality was, for example, Eisenhower was considered a conservative,
right,
was a strong supporter of the New Deal, said that anybody who challenges the rights to labor unions doesn't belong in the political system. And all of this changed through the 70s, and then with Reagan and Thatcher in England, just escalated and hasn't changed since. And if you look at the nature of this system, what happened is very clear. Wages have stagnated. Real wages in the United States are about what they were in the 1970s. Wealth, there has been growth, not as great as before. It's gone into very few pockets. Wealth's been highly concentrated. That has an immediate effect on the functioning of democracy for obvious ways. All kinds of effects on who gets elected, what they do, huge rise in lobbying, cost of elections has skyrocketed. The courts have basically opened the floodgates to corporate funding. It means a representative in Congress is spending several hours a day just trying to appeal to donors for the next election. Meanwhile, lobbyists are meeting with his staff to frame legislation. And of course, the lobbyists overwhelm the staff in background and evidence and power and so on. So they basically write the legislation. Mm-hmm. Democracy disappears. Yeah. Most of the population is essentially unrepresented, and that their own representatives don't pay any attention to their attitudes. And with of course, the major crash in 2007-8 smashed a large majority of the population, benefited the perpetrators. The legislation the congressional legislation to deal with the crash was very striking. It had two components. One was to bail out the banks, who were the perpetrators. The other was to offer some help to the victims, the people who lost their homes, who were foreclosed and so on. Only one part was implemented. Now, people don't have to look at the details to see what's happening. They can see that most of the population has just been cast aside. It doesn't matter what happens to them. And it's pretty self-conscious. So, for example, Alan Greenspan, who was running the Fed, was in charge of the wonderful economy that was highly praised by elites, by economists. It was called the Great Moderation. He was testifying to Congress about the great success of the economy that he was running. And he said it relies on what he called growing worker insecurity. Working people are so insecure that even when employment is high, they're too intimidated to ask for raises, benefits, and so on, which is very healthy for the economy. It's wonderful, Then, of course, when the crash came, it was smashed, and after the crash, same story. Yeah. So, of course, people are angry, bitter, a lot of resentment. She can take all sorts of forms, can take constructive forms like Sanders, Ocasio-Cortez, the New Democrats, more labor activism. It can also take pathological forms, can open up people who are bitter and resentful or easy prey for demagogues who will blame it all on people even more vulnerable than they are, refugees, Mexicans, and so on. So we're seeing a kind of a social breakdown. In fact, it's kind of reminiscent of something that Gramsci described in the the rise of fascism. Right. That the old system is collapsing, the new one has not yet taken shape, and it's a period when you get morbid symptoms, dangers. And I think that's why you see the sudden breakthrough of Trump after years of the base failing to get their candidate, and similarly on the Democratic side, and similarly in election after election in Europe. Some cases, like Brazil, are similar but different in other respects. But I think this kind of neoliberal assault on life and institutions has taken a severe toll, which you see everywhere. Mm. And it's very dramatic if you just look at the figures. So it takes a minimum wage, which kind of sets a floor on wages. Through the golden age, the regimented capitalism, minimum wage tracked productivity almost precisely. Mid-70s, it stops. Productivity increases, not as fast. Minimum wage is flat, which means all wages go down. And the opposite is happening at the higher end. So the rules of corporate governance were changed in the 1980s under Milton Friedman's and others' influence. The corporate goals were set to just work for shareholders, nothing else. Doesn't matter what other consequences there are. And CEOs were given essentially permission to construct their own the boards that nominated, that determined their salaries. So of course, CEO salaries go up. Minimum wage is flat, pulls down other wages. CEO salaries skyrocket, pulls up other management wages. What you end is these are among the factors that are giving the enormous inequality. Yeah. There was also a huge growth of financial institutions, which means more and more regular crashes. Banks, instead of working for the real economy, are mostly involved in transactions that may even harm the economy, certainly don't benefit it. And they're taking over a huge amount of capital being wasted in this predatory financial institutions. So it's a recipe for disaster.
You've talked about the vices and evils of fascism in many of your interviews. You've talked about the dangers of neoliberalism and rapidly rising income inequality and destitution. You've talked about the dangers of communism also. What would be, based on your very long and activist grassroots experience and your scholarly work, what would you recommend as a pragmatic political path to bring all these people across race, religion, color, caste, and creed and gender to come together and form a progressive, forward-looking movement?
Again, there's just no secret. It's pretty much what I said before. Within each of these movements, there has to be developed an understanding of the importance of what's sometimes called intersectionality. That we're basically all in this together. We have similar goals, maybe different emphases, but we have to work together. And a common core would be essential. Traditionally, it's been the labor movement. A revived labor movement could have that role again. So I think you can move towards that by now, and in fact, go much beyond. So, for example, one very interesting development in the United States and elsewhere is the beginnings of the spread of worker-owned enterprises, cooperatives. These are very substantial in scale by now. They can move forward. They can challenge the very idea of the wage contract. We have to remember the wage contract wasn't given by God. You don't have to go back very far in American history to find that it was regarded as an atrocity. The Republican Party in the mid-19th century, one of its slogans was that wage labor is different from slavery only in that it's temporary. That's Abraham Lincoln's Republican Party. What's more important, that was the view of working people. You look at the very lively labor press of the period, same idea, that being forced to work for a master is taking away our fundamental rights as free American citizens. That can be reconstructed too. There's many paths forward possible, but they have to be pursued. They don't just happen by themselves. So it's a matter of picking up the gauntlet and running with it.
That is what we've been trying to do for...
That's what you're doing too.
Yeah. And, like Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire 100 years ago in 1911, the same things are happening in other countries, in Bangladesh and other places, the same, as if, history repeats itself. So it is not happening here, but it is happening somewhere else, so that is, but the history is still on, and the same type of stories we are hearing from various parts of the world.
Easy to find problems, but always the same answer to what to do about them.
What would be your final words to our electrical worker brothers and sisters when it comes to our conversation?
Recognize that they're right at the heart of what should be the base for the development of all the things we're talking about. namely a vibrant, revitalized labor movement working for fundamental aims. First of all, just the kinds of reforms that are needed to make life tolerable, like health services, but further aims like eliminating the need to spend your life living in a totalitarian institution under the rule of masters. There's no reason why people should accept that, and it's not a necessity. We can think of ways to overcome it. For example, worker-owned enterprises, other collectives, cooperatives, other means. These are longer-term goals, but they're not out of sight. They're much closer to realization than colonizing another planet.
Yes,
much
of course,
closer.
Of course. Yeah, that is also the message that I'm trying to impart with them in my classes, to create a sense of hope, to create a sense of reassurance, because otherwise it becomes quite depressing thinking about the things that are happening all over.
But these things are already happening. Garl Perovitz's programs, for example, are expanding in large parts of the Rust Belt. They're still not, and in fact some of them are pretty big, like take Mondragon in Spain. That's a huge conglomerate, worker-owned, very successful, goes back 60 years, productive enterprises, housing, finance, hospitals. It's a model. It's not perfect, a lot of problems, but it's a model that's real and that can be developed. The U.S. Steelworkers Union is now setting up some connections with Mondragon. They might try to develop similar things here. It's a way out of the deindustrialization crisis. So there are options, but you're going to have to struggle for them. They're not going to be easy to attain.